All right, guys. Chapter 11 here. This one is a long one, so hang in tight. All right, we're gonna get started here as soon as possible, so it's not that long. Be looking for different cause and effects. That's what the question is asking you in the packet today. So if you can find, okay, did something happen, and what was the effect of that? You know, like if I punched you, you would have a black eye, right? That's the cause and the effect. So be looking for causes and effects in this chapter. All right, it's long. Here we go. We're going to jump right in. Chapter 11. It had been all we could do to get the old man to leave that moose behind and get on the raft. Old Johnny must have been thinking we'd wait until the following day. He'd only roughed out the semblance of the oars, but the Chinook winds seemed to be letting up, and we were in a panic to get going. We had a couple of 100 pounds of meat on the raft, and even the moose hide, which Johnny had insisted upon, but we'd broken the old man's heart leaving so much of the animal behind. Raymond felt awful about it. Johnny'll never have luck with a moose again, he muttered on our last portage around the falls. That's when Raymond walked to the edge of the cliffs at Virginia Falls, right out over the brink, and heaved his electric guitar into the maelstrom. So right into the falls. He just threw his electric guitar in there. Raymond's mouth was like a jagged scar on his face. By the time we finally pushed off and started down through choppy water into the painted canyon, the stony slopes of Sunblood Mountain were glowing blood red in the late sun. It was the 16th of November. Remember, they started on October 31st. They've been there for a long time. Each of us was wearing a pair of Raymond's gym shoes, having crammed our winter boots and Johnny's tall moccasins into our limited dry storage, along with changes of clothing, our sleeping bags, and Johnny's blanket. The river narrowed between cliffs that were splashed with reds and yellows, and the raft was funneled into a train of high waves. Standing at the oars, struggling to try to get control of the raft, Raymond and I were barely managing to stay on our feet. It looked like our oar locks were going to work well enough, but we'd have to figure out better what we were trying to do with the oars if we were actually going to control the raft, as heavy as it was. Every time the raft wallowed through a wave, the entire deck was awash with water. At the back, the old man was sitting atop the bigger piece of moose meat, the better part of the hind quarter, hanging on to the cord that tied the meat down. The army boxes and the rest of the gear was lashed down toward the front. My feet hurt so much with the cold I wanted to scream. The water temperature couldn't have been but a few degrees above freezing. I had to tell myself that our feet would be okay despite the pain, as long as the air temperature stayed above freezing, too. As we rounded a bend, I glanced back and saw the falls vanish. Bigger than life one moment, the central fact of our lives, gone the next. Another bend in the river, and Raymond gave a shout. He was pointing toward the drift pile of jumbled logs at the tip of an island in the middle of the river. Then I saw what he was pointing at, a piece of metal just above the waterline. A piece of the Cessna, I thought, so the plane that they flew. So they finally saw a piece of that. "Let's get to shore," I yelled, and we spun the raft sideways in the current, rowing as hard as we could for shore. The island was slipping by despite our efforts. It looked as if we weren't going to make it, but finally we were able to reach calmer water, and we beached at the bottom tip of the island. My feet hurt with each step as we hobbled back to the big drift pile. I was afraid of what we might find there, but I knew we had to look. I walked out onto a log that was sawing up and down with the current. It was a piece of wing that was showing. A length of cable stuck out on both ends and trailed into the water. There was nothing else to be seen. I turned to go, but the old man walked out onto the log and squatted down and began to yank on the cable, trying to free it. "We're losing daylight," I fretted. The old man persisted. I didn't want to yell at him. All three of us pulled on the cable together, and it tore free, about 15 feet of it. "I suppose it will come in handy," I said. "It's a lot stronger than parachute cord. Let's get going." Once we got back into the current, the rapids never let up. We lurched and spun, sloshed and wallowed through miles of canyon lined with slabs of rock fallen from the cliffs and pinnacles above. We struck a few rocks that decided to let us by and barely avoided several boulders that would have thrown us all into the river had we breached on them. We rounded a bend and Raymond yelled, "Sweeper!" Barely, just barely, we managed to avoid a tall spruce tree that had fallen into the river, yet remained rooted to the bank. By now, the day was going dim, and we had nowhere to land. I began to wonder if we were going to be trapped out on the river by the darkness. It was all but dark when the canyon walls gave way on the right, where a creek was splashing into the river through a gravel bar. We were exhausted by the time we worked the raft to the shallows, but pleased at how well we were working together now. We had so much more control of the raft than before. Fortunately, the beach was littered with driftwood. We built up a fire. It felt good to get into some dry clothes, especially dry boots. We erected, or made, a framework of poles all around the fire to begin the slow process of drying our wet clothes without burning them. "How far do you think we came today?" I asked Raymond. "It felt like a lot of miles to me," I added hopefully. "Pretty far," Raymond said. I pressed him. "What I mean is, if it's about 200 miles from the falls to Nahanni Butte, how many do you think we have behind us?" "Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe 10 clicks? 6 miles or so?" All the while, the wind turned around and started blowing from a different direction. I was worried enough to dig out the compass. Clint had said the Chinook blows from the west. This wind was blowing from the northeast. The old man saw me look at the compass. He knew exactly what I was thinking. I felt sick, knowing what this meant. There was no doubting that this was air coming down from the Arctic Ocean, not the Pacific. Johnny Raven knew his directions without a compass, and he'd already figured out that the Chinook was over. Johnny offered me some rose hip tea. It tasted warm and good, but it did nothing to calm my fears. The old man spoke at great length around the campfire that night, telling a long story to Raymond, who couldn't understand him. Even so, Raymond was listening intently, as if he understood every word. I think it helped him somehow to calm himself down. Remembering how fast the river could freeze up, I was too nervous to sleep. I could still feel the rumbling of the falls through the ground. I kept seeing the plane crashing against the rock, Clint being thrown into the whitewater. I kept wondering if my father was still searching. I thought he would be, but how could he find us down here? By morning, my worst fears were realized. The river was running cakes of hissing, colliding ice. The Nahanni had dropped several feet as water had formed ice, leaving the raft stranded 100 feet away from the water, across a beach of gravel and ice. Raymond came up from behind me. I could see in his face the enormity of our mistake. I said, "Is there any way we can go back to where we were? Do you think there's a trail upstream? Maybe we could hike back." I felt sick to my stomach waiting for him to speak. He chewed on his lip and shook his head. "There's no trail. Like you saw, the canyon is straight up and down. I remember that canoe guide telling me that the only place there's a trail along the river is the portage around the falls." "I feel so bad," I said. "I talked you into this." Raymond shrugged. "It's too late now," he said. "I better get the raft unstuck and get it back to the water. It's a race with the ice now. The sooner we get going, the better our chances." We could only manage to drag the raft a few feet at a time. The old man wanted to help us, but Raymond wouldn't let him. It took an agony of effort and precious time before we were able to drag it all the way to the river. So, Gabe is feeling terrible right now. It was his idea to move down, and it ended up being a huge mistake. It was something that they should not have done. They should have probably stayed with the old man where he wanted to stay, right? But because he was so pushy, Gabe was able to convince everyone to go with him. It's quite unfortunate, isn't it? We started downriver again, this time wearing our winter boots. Even if they were going to get wet, we knew we needed some insulation on our feet now. We just had to hope that the air temperature didn't get low enough for frostbite. Around the bend, we encountered a break in the canyons where steep forested mountainsides met the river. There was hardly any current for miles, no white water at all, but plenty of sweepers. Our feet were staying warm and dry. We pushed hard on the oars to try to gain any speed compared to simply floating. The river split and meandered among islands below the mountains that rose and rose until they vanished into swirling clouds. We kept pushing along with the hissing ice as the day froze into a changeless gray. We rounded a bend and heard Whitewater. The old man gave a quick cry, and then I saw the river up ahead rushing in a line of waves straight up against the rock wall 50 feet high, where the water was making a sharp left-hand turn. To the right, there was an enormous whirlpool where the water that hadn't made the turn was swirling in a vicious circle. All the current in the river was rampaging straight toward the wall. "We gotta pull left," I yelled to Raymond. Our only chance to avoid crashing into the wall was to try to break out of the current and cross into the lesser whirlpool on the left side. We rowed with all we had, but the current was too strong and the raft too cumbersome. We were being swept right down the current line toward the wall. As we neared the wall, I saw that the force of the river had undercut it, and we were going to be pushed under that overhang. In an instant, all three of us threw ourselves on the raft, and I heard an oar shatter. It was mine. I saw the sharp, broken shaft pass right by my head. Now the raft was spun around and wedged in against the wall, pinned with the river streaming up against us. I knew the raft couldn't stay together long under much of this pressure. Raymond and I scrambled across the raft and tried to push it off the cliff with our legs. I caught a glimpse of the old man scrambling for something to hang on to. I didn't know what it was that freed us, but now we were bumping down the cliff under that low overhang. The raft was spinning. Suddenly, we both realized that the old man was missing. "Johnny!" Raymond yelled, and we looked all around, but he was nowhere to be seen. Without a life jacket, I realized he didn't stand a chance. The raft was bumping along the wall again, and still we couldn't see him. The wall ended, and the raft lumbered to the last part of the rapid. Suddenly, I spotted the thatch of white hair and Johnny's face bobbing in the waves barely behind the raft. I gave a yell, and Raymond saw him too. Raymond lunged across the raft and reached, grabbing the old man by the parka hood as the raft drifted into the slow water below the rapid. We hauled Johnny back onto the raft, where he lay on his side, barely breathing. "He must have been caught under the raft," Raymond said. Johnny's cloth parka was freezing solid as we watched. I thought he was going to die right there before we could get him to shore. Trying to do what we could with one oar, it must have taken us a mile before we were able to reach some shallows. I jumped out with the braided parachute cord we were using for a bowline and dragged the raft a little closer. Raymond and I were shaking violently from the cold. The old man was beyond shivering and had a glassy look in his eyes. Raymond stripped Johnny's clothing off of him. I was shocked. The old man was nothing but skin and bones. Raymond spread out the blue tarp and helped Johnny into a sleeping bag while I fumbled with frozen fingers trying to get a fire started. At last I succeeded, and we ran around in our wet boots collecting driftwood to add to the fire. Finally, we could change clothes and start to dry out our boot liners. It took hours for Johnny to come around. We had been within a thread of losing him. I said to Raymond, "Johnny was right all along, and you told me we should listen to him. This is all my fault. I'm sorry." Raymond shrugged. "Sorry. That's famous last words." "Well, I mean it," I told him. His dark eyes flashed, and he said, "It was just as much me as it was you. I should have known better. It's because I don't know anything. I don't know hardly any more than you do about winter out on the land. I got scared." "So, what do we do now?" "Make a new oar, I guess." Raymond found a birch and started working on the new oar. We had to spend the night there, huddling by the fire. As we put out into the ice-filled river the next day, I said to Raymond that I couldn't get over how Johnny could have survived that swim. Raymond said, "He's spent most of his life out in the cold. Those old people are used to it. That nurse in the hospital in Yellowknife?" He laughed. I was amazed that he could laugh about anything given our recent circumstances. When I came to the hospital to get him, She said he was the hardest guy to give shots to that she ever met in her life. It was really a challenge to get through his skin. No kidding. She said she had to ram that needle at just the right angle. Raymond pointed at his own backside and laughed. She said his skin was tougher than moose hide. From being out in the cold so much of his life, she explained. She was Danae herself, so she knew. That night, we camped at the mouth of a creek that joined the Nahanni from the right side. We spent the night huddling close to the fire, dozing off a little, but we had to keep the fire going, and every so often we had to go down and push the raft into open water. The shallow water was icing up fast, and we knew the raft could get locked in solid if we didn't watch it. The next day, we entered a much deeper canyon. This one towered thousands of feet above us, pitted with caves and broken every mile or two with forested draws that came all the way down to the river. At one point, the river narrowed and pressed between a sheer wall on the right, which rose 1,000 feet or more, and a massive, stranded pinnacle on the left that had trees growing from its top. All the time, our channel of free water in the middle of the river was shrinking as the ice cakes coming down the river adhered to the ice growing along the shores. We pushed on, rowing as hard as we could down the narrowing passage. The river swung slowly through the canyons, bend after bend. Unlike us, it had all the time in the world. The next day, the canyon seemed to die out at first, but within a few miles, we were back under towering walls, and the canyon seemed even more constricted than before. In some places, the riverbed was only a couple of 100 feet wide from wall to wall. We steered our way around immense boulders with logs perched on top, left there by floods, I guessed. The freezing clouds dropped down inside the canyon and clung to the walls and the pinnacles. We were floating now among great blocks of ice that jostled us for position, and we fended them off with driftwood poles we'd picked up from along the shore. We were stunned to hear a motor suddenly, the unmistakable drone of an airplane. "Where is it?" I asked desperately, hoping it would appear for a second in the clouds. "Heading upstream," Raymond said, pointing where Johnny was pointing. "And it's flying high. It's just about gone. They're going someplace else, someplace where it's safe to fly under the clouds. They can't fly down in the canyon with these clouds, that's for sure." I knew what he was thinking. "Up above the falls," I said. "That's where they're going to look." Suddenly, I pictured my father inside that airplane. If we had only stayed put. Could our signal fire still be burning, still barely smoking? I knew that was impossible. We hadn't even built it up on the day we took off. We were in such a hurry. I looked at Raymond. He was thinking all the same things I was. He said, "At least we know they're still searching." But will they ever think of looking down in the canyons on the river itself? I wondered. How could they ever guess what we'd done? Around a bend, I looked downstream and gasped. The ice had formed a dam across the entire width of the river. "Look at that!" I yelled to Raymond. We were suddenly stopped dead in a rising lake full of ice floes. I thought this was the end. Raymond and the old man obviously thought so too. We quit rowing. There was nothing to be done. There was no shore to go to, no way around the dam, just sheer canyon walls on both sides. Johnny stood up for a better look, studied the ice dam for a long time, then sat back down on the moose meat. We both looked to him for some kind of idea, but his face was blank. Raymond and I talked a little, then we just sat down on the duffel bags and waited. I could picture what was going to happen now. The river was going to freeze us in solid right here, maybe sometime during the night. Out of the silence came a sudden, shearing crash, loud as thunder. I wondered for half a second what it was, then jumped up and saw that the ice dam had burst. The lake was pouring through the small gap in the center of the dam. Raymond and I both grabbed the oars. "When it starts to take us," he said, "really hang on." There was no more than a couple of minutes before the raft went surging downstream among the tumbling ice floes. From the corner of my eye, I saw Johnny getting down low, bracing his back against the moose quarter. I concentrated on the gap that had broken open in the ice dam, no more than 100 yards ahead. The gap itself couldn't have been more than 30 feet wide, and the river was pouring through it, down onto a steep chute of white water below. We had no choice but to push on the oars, line up dead center for the gap in the dam, and take whatever happened below. "Hang on," I heard Raymond yell just before we passed through the gap and started down the chute. Down we plunged, fast, into the very bottom of a deep trough, then rode up on a colossal wave cresting below. The raft was slowing as it climbed the wave. I thought we didn't have much momentum to make it over the very top. We were stalling out, and I realized we were just about to slide back down into the trough. Raymond could feel it as well. At the same moment, we both pushed on the oars as hard as we could, topped out on the wave, and started down into a series of lesser waves leading to a calm water. I looked around. All three of us were still on the raft. "We did it!" I shouted. Raymond raised his fist triumphantly. "I can't believe we made it over the top of that thing." Johnny was beaming too. I thought, I bet he's never done anything like that in his whole long life. I couldn't help but let my hopes rise. We were moving again, and as far downstream as I could see, it was all calm water. We threaded our way among countless ice floes, many standing up like icebergs. Mid-afternoon, the canyon opened up onto a wide, forested valley with a stream coming in from the right that drained mountains standing back at the distance. The left side of the valley was made up of an immense gravel bar below three side canyons that had gouged their way down through the flat escarpment, tilting toward the high mountains. A creek ran across the gravel bar toward the Nahanni, entering the river at a dozen places along the shore. I could see the channels picking new paths around ones that had previously frozen shut. "Dead Men Valley," the old man said in English. It was apparent that this was a name and place that he knew. Some miles ahead, we could see the narrow gate where Dead Men Valley ended and the Nahanni entered another, deeper canyon. We knew we had no choice but to stay with the river, enter that next canyon, and hope to squeak on through to Nahanni Butte. But as we were nearing the gate of the canyon, we came around a bend and saw that the ice had sealed the surface on the river solid from one bank to another, as far downriver as we could see. The river was running under the ice from here on. "This is it," I yelled. "Get your knife ready to cut stuff loose," Raymond yelled back. In another minute, we were swept against the ice. We cut all the tie-downs as fast as we could and started unloading the raft. Ice floes were jamming up against the raft, and water was sweeping across us and freezing. "Which shore should we go to?" I shouted. Johnny Raven was pointing to the right side. We were throwing everything off into the ice as fast as we could. As I stepped off of the raft with the bigger piece of moose meat on my back, I slipped and fell hard on the edge of the ice, landing on my left side without the chance to break my fall. I watched the meat plunge into the river and disappear under the ice. I looked up and saw Raymond's eyes and the old man's staring where the meat had disappeared. Suddenly, I realized how bad my left side hurt, where I cracked a rib in football. I stumbled around in delirium, shuttling gear up to the top of the riverbank and helping Raymond with the heavy frozen moose hide. After that, I went back to the raft, but found we'd already taken everything off of it. I recovered the bowline we'd braided from the parachute cord, then watched as the raft buckled and went under the ice. When I trudged up the bank and fell in a heap, stricken with remorse that hurt much worse than the pain in my side. Raymond was starting a fire with birch bark and kitchen matches. "It only makes sense that we'd have bad luck with moose," I heard him mutter, "leaving all that meat behind." And that's the end of chapter 11. Man, sure seems Gabe is messing up a lot right now. I hope he turns it around later in this book and that they're able to survive, because right now it's not looking too good. He just lost them a lot of their food. So we shall see. Remember, for the questions, you need to find causes and effects, right? There's a lot that happened in that chapter, so if you need to rewind it, that's totally fine. All right. I hope you guys have a good day, week, whenever you're watching this. All right. Peace out. Bye.